Room 12 burned to the ground in a devastating fire decades ago. Yet on a lonely night shift, I encountered the nurse who perished there, still roaming the halls. I still remember that cold night as if it were yesterday. I worked as a janitor at a small-town hospital with faded yellow walls that flaked like old paint, and a lingering odor of bleach mixed with an underlying sourness I could never quite place. The hospital had its share of whispered legends, but nothing prepared me for what I would see near Room 12. Room 12 had a history, a tragic tale that haunted the corridors. Decades ago, a fierce fire had engulfed that room. I'd heard the story many times, how flames erupted suddenly one winter evening, the heat and smoke choking everyone inside, and how Nurse Clara, who had dedicated her life to caring for patients, had been trapped in a heroic but ultimately futile attempt to save those who needed her. She had perished amidst the roaring inferno. The loss had scarred the hospital's memory, and some staff even claimed that on certain nights, you could sense her sorrow lingering in the air. It was around 1 a.m. on a night that felt especially heavy with silence. I was mopping the long, empty hallways, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing intermittently, as if struggling to stay lit. My footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors, and I could see my tired reflection in every puddle of water. As I approached Room 12, the temperature seemed to drop. The air grew unnaturally still, and a chill ran down my spine. While I was cleaning in the corridor outside Room 12, I heard something, a slow, measured sound of footsteps following me. I paused, gripping my mop tighter. I pulled out an earbud and listened. The sound was unmistakable. Deliberate footsteps on the tile, not hurried but almost reverent. I turned slowly. At first, there was nothing. Only the dim, empty hallway stretching out with shadows gathering in the corners. I resumed my work, trying to convince myself that it was only the late-night quiet playing tricks on my mind. But moments later, the footsteps came again, this time unmistakably close. I turned, and there, at the far end of the hall, stood a figure I could barely believe. A woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, crisp white dress with a little cap that looked like it belonged to another era. Her skin was unnaturally pale, and her dark, unseeing eyes seemed to bore right through me. I recall feeling the air grow even colder, as if an invisible hand had swept through the corridor. My heart hammered in my chest. I managed to stammer, Are you okay?" But she didn't speak. Instead, she began walking toward me. Every step she took was silent, as if her feet barely touched the ground. I watched, transfixed by the surreal image of her gliding toward me without any sound of movement. Her pace was slow, deliberate, and each step seemed to echo in the recesses of my mind. I remember the texture of the air, thick, heavy, almost suffocating, with a mixture of antiseptic and the faint, lingering scent of smoke from that fateful fire. I watched as she neared, her head tilting slightly to one side in an almost unnatural manner. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, I blinked, and in that split second, she was nearly upon me, her face contorted into a smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile that felt both mournful and terrifying. Instinct took over. I dropped my mop with a clatter that echoed down the hall and turned on my heels, sprinting to the nearest break room. I slammed the door shut behind me. my breath coming in ragged gasps as I listened for any sound of pursuit. For what felt like an eternity, the only noise was the hum of the lights and my own pounding heart. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek through the window in the break room. The hallway was empty. The figure had vanished without a trace. The following morning, with hands still trembling and the image of that ghostly nurse burned into my mind, I told the night crew what I had experienced. Most of them dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a result of too many lonely hours in a creaking old building. However, an older nurse named Betty pulled me aside, her voice low and somber. "You saw Clara, didn't you?" she whispered, her eyes filled with a knowing sadness. She explained that Nurse Clara had died in the fire in room 12, and that sometimes, on nights like that, her spirit was said to still check on the patients, unable to rest. I left that job the very next day, haunted by the encounter. Every time I pass a hospital corridor, I remember that cold, sorrowful figure, a reminder that sometimes the past refuses to fade away, lingering in the silence of empty halls. Story number 2. An elevator ride that should have been routine plunged me into a darkness where a haunting shuffling sound made me question everything I thought I knew about this place. I still cannot forget the night that changed my perspective on the hospital's elevators forever. I was a med student on my first night shift at a sprawling city hospital, a place of gleaming glass and sterile corridors. Despite its modern exterior, there was something unsettling about the inner workings of that building, a feeling I would come to dread. It was around 3 a.m. when I needed to check on a patient on the 5th floor. Exhausted, yet determined, I made my way to the elevator. The interior was dim, with walls marred by scratches and a flickering light that seemed determined to fail. I pressed the button for the 5th floor and stepped in, noticing how the stale air inside felt almost suffocating. The doors slid shut with a groan that echoed off the metal walls. Almost immediately, the elevator began its ascent. I closed my eyes for a moment, leaning back against the cold, scratched panel, trying to gather my thoughts. But within seconds, the elevator jolted violently. The lights stuttered, plunging the confined space into brief moments of darkness before flickering back to life. I pressed the button repeatedly, expecting it to resume its course, but it refused to budge. Then, without any warning, the elevator plunged downward in a free fall that stole my breath. I gripped the railing with desperate intensity, my stomach churning as if I were on the world's worst roller coaster. Time seemed to slow. Every second stretched out in terror until the descent halted as abruptly as it had begun. I was left in an unsettling silence, and that's when I heard it. A sound so vivid and horrifying that it seared itself into my memory. It was a shuffling noise, unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. It was an external sound, a dragging, scraping noise that resembled heavy, wet boots sliding across a metal floor. The sound was deliberate, each scrape resonating as if the very cables of the elevator were being strained by something moving slowly, methodically across the floor. The clatter was almost musical in its cadence, an eerie, inhuman rhythm that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I clutched the rail, every muscle tense with terror, as I strained to locate the source of the sound. The air in the elevator grew colder still, and I could feel a dampness seeping into my skin, as if I were trapped in a place where decay and time had no meaning. Suddenly, the elevator's doors creaked open. I hesitated, not daring to move until I gathered the courage to press the closed door button. The doors shuddered shut, and then, miraculously, the elevator began to ascend again. After what felt like an eternity, the doors finally opened onto the familiar, brightly lit 5th floor. The sterile corridors, with their clean white walls and clinical scent of disinfectant, felt like a safe haven in stark contrast to what I had just experienced. I stumbled out, my heart still pounding, and immediately reported the malfunction. The supervisor, reviewing the logs later, confirmed something even more chilling. That particular elevator had never moved past the 3rd floor on that night. Later, whispered rumors among the older staff spoke of a hidden basement level, sealed off after a catastrophic flood had claimed dozens of patients years ago. Some even said that on certain nights, the building itself seemed to remember those lost souls, and the elevator, in its mysterious malfunction, might be a conduit to that forbidden place. Even now, I can still hear that shuffling sound echoing in my mind, questioning what lies hidden in the darkness below. Story number 3. In room 308, a bed that was meant to be empty revealed evidence of a lingering presence from a tragedy that claimed so many lives in 1973. It was one of those nights when the hospital's corridors felt like they held secrets in every shadow. I was working as a security guard, making my routine rounds through the 3rd floor wing of a suburban hospital. The hallways were quiet, illuminated by a low, flickering light that barely reached the far corners. There was a constant hum, a mix of the air conditioning and the soft beeping of distant machines that always accompanied me on my rounds. I reached room 308, a unit that was supposed to be vacant. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped out, carrying with it an unsettling chill that made the hair on my arms stand up. I pushed the door open slowly, and as I stepped inside, an immediate sense of unease washed over me. The room was dark and still. The curtains were drawn tight, and the only light came from a weak lamp in the corner. Unlike the rest of the hospital, the air in this room felt heavy and musty, as if it were laden with unspoken grief. My flashlight swept across the room until it landed on the hospital bed. It was neatly made, yet something felt off. I approached it slowly, every step echoing in the silence. As I reached the bed, I noticed an unusual indentation on the pillow, a deep, fresh dent, as if a head had just rested there only moments before. A chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air raced through me. I reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, and tugged at the edge of the blanket. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in response to my intrusion, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sigh behind me, a sound filled with sorrow and longing. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing across the room, but there was nothing there. The bed remained, its sheets undisturbed except for that haunting imprint. I later learned that 1973 had been a year of unspeakable tragedy for this hospital. A catastrophic event, a massive failure in the hospital's old infrastructure combined with a series of fatal errors, had led to the deaths of dozens of patients that fateful year. The loss was so profound that even years later, whispers of that dark chapter continued to circulate among the staff. It was said that many of those who died had never truly left, their presence lingering in the very walls of the hospital. In the days that followed my encounter, a janitor cleaning beneath the bed discovered a faded hospital bracelet. Its inscription was worn almost to the point of illegibility, but the date, 1973, was still visible, a stark reminder of the lives lost and the heavy sorrow that had been imprinted on that very room. The sight of that bracelet, coupled with the imprint on the pillow and the eerie sigh I had heard, left me with a lingering question. Was the bed's mark a mere coincidence, or was it the residual presence of a spirit still mourning its tragic fate? Every time I pass room 308 now, I feel that same heavy air, that same unspoken sadness. The memory of that night is a constant reminder that sometimes the past reaches out with quiet desperation, reminding us that some tragedies never truly end. They simply linger in the shadows. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more horror video. Goodbye.